Clover, and I'm going to be trying to share with you what I've learned over the last year about how to set puzzles that make people feel good when they solve them. So this puzzle on the screen is called Black Math, and this is a puzzle that I set. And when I originally set this puzzle, my intention was to use it to communicate two ideas that I thought were cool. One of those ideas is that there's an equivalence in any Sudoku between these cells and these cells. The green cells contain exactly the same digits as the orange cells, plus one set of the digits 1 through 9. The second idea is an idea about divisibility by 3, specifically the idea that anytime you have 3 consecutive integers, their sum is always divisible by 3. So 1 plus 2 plus 3 is divisible by 3, 4 plus 5 plus 6 is divisible by 3, and so on. And so what I hoped to communicate when I set this puzzle was that if you kind of take those two ideas, you grab them both by the necks and you bash them together, you end up being able eventually to make the deduction that these 3 cells cannot be a run of consecutive integers, so that this can be proven not to work using a combination of set equivalence theory and divisibility by 3. And that instead, these cells have to look like this. These 2 cells have to be the same. Almost universally, everybody who tried it either said something like, I didn't know what to do, I got stuck, I felt like I had to bifurcate. Or, and these are the comments that kind of stung for me as a setter, or there were a number of people who said something like, oh, I assumed you wanted me to just test all of the options for like this V clue or for these Kropke dots, or, you know, people who said other things that implied that they had not only felt like they had to bifurcate on this puzzle, but that something about this puzzle had read to them as if bifurcation or just kind of bashing, case testing without logic behind it had been my intention. In other words, I had failed to communicate. A couple of days later, Simon from Cracking the Cryptic happened to pop onto Discord and left a message saying something along the lines of, we have this really big backlog of super monstrously hard puzzles right now that are going to make really long videos. Does anybody happen to have on hand like some approachable, kind of elegant, medium difficulty, medium length puzzles? The thought that just happened to pop into my head was about this puzzle, and I thought to myself, if there's one person in the universe who will so steadfastly refuse to bifurcate that they will definitely either fail to solve it, which I didn't think was going to happen, or will get to the point that I was trying rather poorly to communicate, it would be Simon from Cracking the Cryptic. So I replied to his message and I attached this puzzle. And I waited, and I waited, and after a week or two, I had decided that probably what had happened is that he'd sent it to the testers, and they had said, oh, this is a puzzle where you have to bifurcate. But a couple of weeks passed, and I saw this. And here's what had happened. So Simon had started the puzzle and had very quickly found the 2 ideas that I had set out trying to convey. You can see that in right here, he has that highlighted. He has his purple cells and his red cells.
X plus 1, and if this was a lower digit, therefore, it would be x minus 1. So we could sum these 3 digits, and they would sum to 3x.
Yep, he spotted
so
the divisibility by 3. And he's at the point where the only thing he really has to do to crack the puzzle open is figure out that these 2 cells are the same, and that that's implied by combining those 2 ideas. And here's what ended up happening.
Have I missed out? I might have missed off a square. I don't think I did miss off a square there.
You didn't.
This is not 1 mod 3.
It is.
I don't, and sorry, just to explain what a black Kropki dot. I know a black Kropki dot is divisible by 3.
Simon led us through, at this point, this emotional journey of spending several minutes absolutely convinced that either I had given him a broken puzzle, that Odd Van de Vettering's set equivalence was actually not correct, that he had derived it incorrectly, that math itself no longer worked. I can see the video title here. Until finally we ended up here.
Another set of the digits 1 to 9.
Wait for it.
Oh, good grief. Okay. Sorry, I have not gone, well, I have gone completely crazy. I have been fooled. This is not the same as that. This is not the same as that because these are all in different boxes of the Sudoku. So this does not have to be a run of, it doesn't have to be something like 5, 6, 7, because it could be 5, 6, 5.
Now, when you look at the YouTube comments for this video, the ones that talk about their experience doing the puzzle themselves, I think are very telling because it makes it clear that this still was not an incredibly successful puzzle. They say things like, I tested all the cases, I worked tediously on a chain in the bottom right, I slowly boiled down digits. My solution wasn't elegant, but it worked. But if you look at the comments that talk not about the solve, but about Simon's solve, but about the video, you get stuff that looks like this. Oh my god, this is my favorite episode of Cracking the Cryptic so far. All the emotional drama that I often go through when trying to solve one of these. And I guess the point I want to make by telling this story is that it didn't make a spectacular video because it was a spectacular puzzle. It made a spectacular video because it happened to find exactly the right audience in Simon. I believe that a really good puzzle setter has, among other abilities, the ability to model what a solver is thinking and focusing on and seeing at each step they arrive at in the solve of a puzzle. And I believe that that's the sense in which I initially failed with this puzzle. I had been sitting there staring at Mod 3 arithmetic for so freaking long that I couldn't see anything else. I didn't find the right audience for this at first. But in Simon, I happened to find someone who just whatever proclivity he has led him to look at the puzzle in exactly the same way that I happen to look at it. The more audiences you learn to empathize with, and the harder you work specifically on using that cognitive empathy, on trying to predict what your solvers are going to see, and the more you think about that based on feedback that you get, the more versatile a setter you'll be. The next thing I want to talk about, if we're going to make puzzles that make people happy, is, do I just mean that we should make easy puzzles? Because if you look at the YouTube comments on Cracking the Cryptic videos, and this is something you especially see on Simon's videos when Simon happens to do a more approachable puzzle, there are always comments like this. And the second one I've clipped here in particular is something that brings me a lot of joy as a setter. This person has said, "This is my favorite kind of puzzle, one that doesn't make me feel stupid. I managed to solve it on my own." Nobody wakes up in the morning and thinks, geez, I really hope somebody comes along today and makes me feel stupid. And really great puzzles, whether they're hard or easy, do often have this way of making the solver feel smart. The Miracle Sudoku video, 25 minutes long. That's a very short video by today's standards on the channel. And yet the Miracle Sudoku had this outsized impact on the Sudoku world. But there are also phenomenally successful, very, very difficult puzzles that are played on Cracking the Cryptic. Some of the best Cracking the Cryptic videos have featured astonishingly difficult puzzles. This is Mitchell Lee's Thermo, same author as the previous puzzle. But this one we're going to talk about later through a lens of where difficulty comes from. Here's where we're going with this conversation about difficulty. There's absolutely nothing wrong with difficult or even extremely difficult puzzles. But there is something wrong with puzzles that make solvers feel stupid. So how do you reconcile those two things? The way I look at it is, if your puzzle is hard, and in fact, the harder your puzzle is, the more of a burden there is on you as a setter to be certain that the ideas in the puzzle justify how hard it is. In other words, if the difficulty in your puzzle is coming from the fact that your puzzle is showing something really novel or something that's just inherently hard, then it's going to be a hard puzzle. And as long as you do the best job you possibly can of showing those ideas clearly and fairly without feeling arbitrary or obscure, that's completely fine. But if the ideas in your puzzle aren't particularly hard, you've just hidden them away to keep people from spotting what to do next, tread carefully, because that's the territory where your solvers start to feel frustrated. In other words, if you want your solvers to walk away from your puzzle feeling smart, whatever level of difficulty the puzzle is at, try to keep from making your puzzle harder than the ideas in it. And I'll show you an example in a moment. Personally, these are my criteria as a solver. The puzzles that I find satisfyingly hard to solve tend to be the ones that have a tough idea or even many tough ideas presented fairly. So when I look at a puzzle that's satisfyingly hard, what I usually think is, I know something strange is happening here. I don't know exactly how it's going to play out, but I see something weird. Let's figure out how it behaves. This is my classic example of hard but clear. In other words, this is my classic example of a puzzle that I think succeeds in justifying its own difficulty. Why? So the difficulty in this puzzle comes from this very interesting and at the time not very well known idea that there is an exact equivalence between the cells that Simon has highlighted in blue here and the cells that Simon has highlighted in purple. Now that is a super stinking hard idea. But look at how Mitchell Lee has chosen to present this idea. I would argue that this is the clearest possible presentation of this hard idea. In other words, if you just highlighted every cell that was covered by a thermo, you would be halfway to already having that set equivalence. And correspondingly, when I first saw this puzzle, I worked on this happily for several hours because I knew almost immediately on looking at it that the thing of interest was the thermos and this pattern arrangement of thermometers. What else could it possibly be? But what I didn't know was what they did. And that is what makes a hard puzzle intriguing. And therefore, while the puzzle is hard, this puzzle, I think, is justifiably hard. Let's compare it to something. This is my take from very, very, very early in my setting on the same set equivalence. And once you know what you're looking for, if you kind of squint, you can see it. This was something I set very early on when I had just learned about set. I was incredibly excited about it. And I hadn't really gotten my head around the idea of a solve path yet. And you can see just looking at the two puzzles that this is not a very fair presentation of that idea of set equivalence. Now I want to talk about my most recent Cracking the Cryptic feature, which was a puzzle called How Very Odd. I want to use this puzzle as an example to talk about two things that are the greatest contributors, in my view, to justifying the difficulty of a hard puzzle. One is telegraphing, and the other is logical flow. What you're looking at on screen here, on the left, is the first version of How Very Odd, my rough draft. On the right is the version that was featured on Cracking the Cryptic recently. And I want you to take a look at some of the differences here in light of this concept that a challenging idea is better justified when it's presented fairly and clearly. The central idea in either of these puzzles has to do with these cells that I've highlighted in orange in each grid. The central idea of this solve is that due to the positioning of these even cells that I've highlighted in peach on the two grids, one is forced into exactly one of the two thermobulbs in orange, and 9 is forced into exactly one of the two thermotips in orange. This is true in both puzzles. I posted the version on the left for testing, and it was pretty much ignored. I mean, I think a couple of people solved it. Nobody gave me any comments on it. And frankly, when I went back and solved it myself, it was not a lot of fun. So what changed to take this from a puzzle that really wasn't that much fun to a puzzle that still has the same central conceits, but that was good enough to merit a Cracking the Cryptic feature? I've moved the thermos so that instead of being symmetrical only around the positive diagonal, they now have this rotational symmetry and this kind of centrality around the center box of the puzzle. They're also kind of encapsulating the most exciting looking part of the puzzle now. Whereas here, okay, even if you do manage to decide that you're supposed to be looking at these two thermos in conjunction first, there's not necessarily anything that tells you, here's what the payoff for that is going to be. Are you supposed to go from the thermotips to like this thermo over here? Are you supposed to go from the thermobulbs to this thermo down here? Does it somehow restrict like this long thermo? I don't know. Over here though, you can see that as soon as you figure something out about these thermobulbs and these thermotips, that will probably tell you something about this thermo and about this one. And as soon as you figure something out about these even digits, that'll probably tell you something about these even digits. On the screen now is a brief list of visual and logical features that I've found as a setter tend to draw your solver's attention to a place where you want it drawn. The first 4 of these you can see to some extent just in this one example. But when it comes to what I'll call implied logical flow, I think logical flow deserves a bit of a further conversation. So when I say implied logical flow, what I mean is, for instance, in this puzzle on the right, you can see that once you work out what goes, or roughly what goes, in these orange colored cells, you can predict that they'll have an impact on the bulb and tip of these two thermos respectively, because they kind of intersect the line formed by those. So even before you know what deduction you'll be able to make about those orange cells, even before that point, you know that that deduction, once you've made it, is useful. Therefore, even before you make the deduction itself, you may already have a sense of what the logical flow of the puzzle will look like. And the puzzle should have logical flow. And that's going to be the subject of the next part of this story. I finished that first version. I ended up deciding that the puzzle needed to get cleaner, so I worked on it a little bit more. And I ended up coming up with version 2, which as you can see looks pretty similar to the version that was featured on Cracking the Cryptic. And here's what happened with version 2. So I was actually in an airport. I was standing in line at security. And I noticed that there were some people in the voice chat on the Cracking the Cryptic Discord, and I thought, oh, let me just drop this puzzle in there, just see if anybody's kind of interested in taking a look at it, or if anybody's looking for something to solve. Let's just see what people think, and maybe it'll entertain me for a little bit while I'm kind of waiting in this long security line. So I dropped the puzzle in there. And someone who I know to be a very strong solver, and also an excellent setter, happened to be looking for something to solve, happened to look at this and think that it looked interesting, and decided to start solving it, and was giving me updates as he worked on it, as I was kind of going through this line in the airport. The first few messages that he sent me had a really positive tone. He was having a lot of fun. He cracked some of the logic. He had figured out more or less the opening. He got a little bit hung up at one point, then caught what was going on and said he literally called it cheeky out loud when he figured out what the next step was. So when I had to step away for a minute to actually go through airport security, I was feeling pretty confident about this puzzle and about my friend's solve of it. So I put my phone aside for maybe half an hour or an hour, and I came back after that point, and I caught back up on the messages that my friend had sent while he was test solving this puzzle. So when I got back, I read over the messages that I had received about this puzzle and was originally very happy to find that it seemed like everybody in the Discord voice chat had jumped in and started collaborating over time to try to get this puzzle test solved. And I started reading the messages, and the tone got darker and darker as the solve went on. Because people eventually, once they got past the opening, ran into some Sudoku techniques that, for reasons I'll talk about in a minute, didn't play well in this puzzle. And it got to the point where the person who I had originally asked to test solve the puzzle was completely fed up. And was to the point where I think the last message in the chain of messages that I got before the puzzle was finally fully tested said something like, I feel like the ending of this made the work that I did on the beginning not even worth it. Which, by the way, every negative comment I got about the solution path to this version of the puzzle was 100% valid and justified. This is not a test solver whining or test solvers whining. This was a big screw up on my part. And I'm going to explain what happened, how it happened, and how to avoid making your test solvers cry. So in order to understand how version 2 had started out so fun, but had turned into an absolute disaster that was not fun for anybody to solve by the end, I want to start by talking a bit about how I build a sense of logical flow into my puzzles in general. And I'm going to use the opening of the final version of this puzzle, How Very Odd, as an example. And then I'll explain what went off the rails with this version. I had some interesting thoughts about interactions between thermos and odd and even digits, just based on play that I had done in the past, just based on, messing around enough puzzles, looking at stuff, thinking about stuff. And I had just noticed that normally if you have a length 6 thermo, the first digit is only restricted to 1, 2, 3, or 4. The last digit is only restricted to 6, 7, 8, or 9. But if you put an even cell one space away from one end of the thermo, you get more of a restriction than you might expect because you can no longer have the thermo be maximal, that would force an odd digit into this cell. You can also no longer have the thermo be minimal, because that forces an odd digit into this cell. So you end up with a restriction where this can't be 4, it has to be 1, 2, or 3, and this has to be 7, 8, or 9. Now, the next thing that popped into my head here as I was starting to lay this out in the first version is that, okay, this thermo can only be 2 or 4. This thermo can, or this even cell can only be 2 or 4. This even cell can only be 6 or 8. But there's also this weird, like, implied restriction here, where they not only can be 2 and 4, 6 or 8, but they can't be 4 and 6 at the same time. Because you would have to put 5 and 2 cells here. So the way I thought about it at first is, if you have this thermo setup, either this has to be a 1, because that's a 2, or this has to be a 9, because that's an 8, or possibly both. We can't have this thermo setup with neither a 1 nor a 9 on it, because then what we end up with is we end up with a forced 4 and 6. We got to put 5 on our thermo twice. That's impossible. So that was just the original logic that I had started with, and I set this up so that you end up with something that looks like this. You know, after the end of this piece of logic, that there has to be a 1 in one of these cells, there has to be a 9 in one of these cells, because these two even digits have to be 6 or 8, and they can't be the same as each other, because if they were, they would collectively see all 4 of the even numbers in box 5. And likewise here, so that's 2 or 4, they can't be the same as each other. So these cells are all different. There's a 2 and a 4, there's a 6 and an 8. And one of these is a 9. One of these is a 1. At that point, as a setter, if I'm practicing good cognitive empathy, what I'm thinking is, what is my solver looking at now? And what is foremost in their mind? And the way I viewed it is, there are 2 things that are on the solver's mind right now, at this point in the solve, assuming this is the start. One is that they've probably, in order to get this deduction, they've probably just worked out that these 4 cells have to be different, and that one of them has to be 4 and 8, and one of them has to be 2 and 6. The other thing is that they've probably worked out that there has to be a 1 here, there has to be a 9 here. And my thought is, how can I use that without completely collapsing what they've already figured out? Well, okay. What takes advantage of this set of even cells? Well, I noticed that, for instance, this orange cell sees both of these. And there are only 2 possibilities for this pair of digits. This could either be the 2, 6 thermo, and then this is the 4, 8, in which case this cell can only be 2 or 8 because it sees a 4 and a 6. This could be the 4, 8 thermo, and this could be the 2, 6, in which case this cell could only be a 4 or a 6 because it sees a 2 and an 8. Now, how do I get it so that, if you think about it right, that cell is restricted to being in one of those 2 universes, but not both? Well, here's how you do it. If you have a fixed 1 and a fixed 9, a good trick is to run a thermo so that the bulb sees the 1 and the tail sees the 9. That means that the lowest this can be is 2, the highest that can be is 8. And coincidentally, one of the other things that I had in mind that my solver would be thinking about at this point is whether these 2 digits are 4 and 6 or whether they are 2 and 8. Well, now, if they're 4 and 6, there's nothing I can put here on this square on the thermo. So this forces 2 and 8. So at this point, here's what I'm looking at as a setter. I'm thinking, well, what would it be nice for someone to have here? Because I don't really see a whole lot for somebody to grab onto from this point. And the thing that jumped out to me as a setter is that these digits, that can't be a 1, that can't be a 9, these digits almost look like a naked triple, and so do these digits. And so I thought to myself, well, maybe I can set it up so that once they've made that deduction, what they're staring at, because they've just finished working out what has to be in the bulb and the end of the thermo, is a naked triple. And that is why I placed a 5 given here. Because that gives you this. In turn, and this was just a happy accident, and there are a lot of happy accidents while setting. In turn, that gives you a 1-3 pair here because there's a 1 and 3 in the triple, and a 7-9 pair here. Okay, next thought from Clover as a setter. What my solver has just worked out, what's foremost in their mind, is, oh hey, we just got these pairs, we just got these bi values. This 1-3, this 7-9. I would like, now that I have those bi values, to be able to start working out which one is which, whether it's 1-3 or 3-1, 7-9 or 9-7. And so I experimented with a number of different ways to kind of connect those, but what I ended up doing was adding this thermometer. Specifically for the reason that I think that what the solver would be looking at this point would be these pairs. And so giving them something that connects those pairs almost guarantees that that's going to be the next place they go. So that's what building logical flow looks like for me. Not everybody sets the same way, but I think it's inarguable that logical flow, to some extent or another, is useful to think about when you're setting. How, when you give a deduction that isn't necessarily just strictly based on the last thing your solver figured out, but that lives in the same neighborhood, that interacts with whatever the last thing is that you think they would have looked at. That deduction will feel fairer and more satisfying than a comparable deduction that requires you to go across the grid to find it. And when you get frustrated at the end of a puzzle and you just hit the solution path button and take whatever F-puzzle spits out, you end up getting a solution path that looks like this. Okay, singles, 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 pairs, pairs, pairs. Okay, there are a whole bunch of contradictions here. There is logic to it. But by ceasing to think in terms of logical flow and just leaving it to the computer, which is agnostic as to flow, like the computer doesn't have cognitive empathy, it doesn't know what a solver is looking at any given time, you immediately lose your ability to control how well telegraphed your deductions feel. And that turned the end of this version of the puzzle into a disaster. And I learned a lot from that. I went back and I retooled the entire ending completely by hand. Took a really long time. Total pain. But would this puzzle have been featured on Cracking the Cryptic if I had left it at that? Absolutely not. Because it turned out that even though maybe these deductions were technically fair in the sense of there is a way to spot each of them, they were so poorly placed, so poorly located, and so kind of out of character with the logic of the beginning of the puzzle, that it no longer felt fun, it just felt frustrating. But at the end of the day, all of that frustrating, meticulous time spent retooling the ending and finally getting the puzzle to flow from beginning to end was time well spent, because among many other very kind comments, this one really stood out to me on the video where How Very Odd was eventually featured. This person says that their daughter joined them to watch the video, was enthralled by the logic, and pulled out a book of classic Sudokus and started working her way through it. And the idea that something that I put together would capture somebody's attention so much that they want to keep solving puzzles after the video is over is what makes every moment of frustration and every questionable iteration of a puzzle 100% worth it in the end. Let's talk a little bit about novelty now. So I'm going to divide the idea of novelty up into two different concepts which have less to do with each other than I think is commonly thought. And the first is something I have a little less to say about. The first is novelty that comes from literally just newness. Novelty that comes from having, for instance, a homegrown rule set that nobody has ever seen before. So you click on the puzzle and it's triangles and circles and squares, and nobody, no matter how experienced they are, knows where to start with it. That type of novelty is something that is contentious, I think. Some setters and some solvers gravitate to it. Some setters and some solvers shy away from it. I tend to be more towards that side as a setter, so I'm speaking primarily as a solver here. Although I would give the advice to anybody who wants to get into setting puzzles to not feel as if the only way you can set a novel or interesting puzzle is by thinking up something nobody's ever seen before. I would, if you're just getting into setting puzzles, you will have more fun if you just do a couple of practice puzzles using rule sets that don't have this additional burden of having to try to suss out the logic from scratch, along with the burden of setting the puzzle. Now, for people who set puzzles using novel rule sets, and I know a couple of setters who do just fantastic and extremely inventive puzzles, my one piece of advice is, if you remember what I said earlier about difficulty, the burden on you if you are using a rule set for Sudoku that has not been used or is rarely used, or rule sets that have never been combined before as far as you know, the burden on you to justify the difficulty of that puzzle is even greater than with a standard puzzle. Why? Because of the concept of cognitive load. So cognitive load, in a nutshell, is a term for the demand that something puts on your working memory. And so a task imposes more cognitive load if it effectively makes you hold on to more information. And I believe that in Sudoku, cognitive load correlates to perceived difficulty. And I think that that's why we talked about puzzles that feel arbitrary earlier. That's why arbitrariness of the type I was talking about earlier feels hard, because you don't need to hold as much information actively in your memory to solve a puzzle where the deductions naturally flow one from the other and you can predict where they're going to be. You don't need as much working memory capacity used for that as you do for a puzzle where the next deduction could be something completely unrelated halfway across the grid. So difficulty correlates with cognitive load. The presence of a rule set that your solver is not familiar with will naturally impose cognitive load because your solver has to remember the rules. And that means that the perceived difficulty of your puzzle may be higher. The more novel what you're doing is, in this sense of the word novelty, the more burden there is on you to manage the cognitive load you're imposing on your audience. And I'll also just reiterate, if you are starting to set puzzles, or if you're thinking about starting to set puzzles, there is time to learn to do the basics really well first. So let's talk about the other kind of novelty. And this is the one that I am more interested in talking about, I think, because this is the one that I go out of my way to try to build into my puzzles, and sometimes I fail, sometimes I succeed. So the puzzle you're looking at here is the very descriptively titled Antiknight Killer Cage Sudoku number 2 by Phistomefel. And this puzzle, I mean, it's an Antiknight killer. Antiknight and Killer Cage are widely known. They're very frequently set. I actually think that Killer Cage is the most common Sudoku variant published in the Discord Puzzle Archive. So these are rule sets that will not feel novel or unfamiliar to the majority of solvers. However, I'm going to argue that this puzzle has this quality of novelty, or what I'm going to call freshness, that's a characteristic of a really, really good Sudoku. And what do I mean by that? Let's drill in on the idea of a great solve moment. So a great puzzle will often produce these moments that have something to do with what I'm calling freshness. You could also call this catharsis, kind of tension and release. Surprise, you could call it an aha moment. But I think that anybody who solved a handful of puzzles will not find this to be something weird that I'm saying. We'll be able to recognize that while you're solving a really great puzzle, there are these moments that feel kind of like surprise, feel kind of like, aha, I got it, that are characteristic of a really fun solve. And let me go out on a limb here and make an analogy between these moments in a solve and humor. And I'm sorry about this, but I'm going to tell you a joke. It's a pretty bad joke. And then I'm going to go and make the joke not funny by explaining it. But just roll with me here. So here's the joke. So Ham Sandwich walks into a bar, and the bartender says, "Sorry, buddy, we don't serve food here." Sorry, my delivery is not the best either. But I wanted to have a joke on the table so we could talk about this analogy that I'm setting up here. I want to posit that humor has these elements. There's an expectation, and then there's something that counters that expectation, all on a background of some kind of common ground of knowledge. In the really bad joke that I just told, the common ground is that we both know, like, what the phrase "we don't serve food here" means. We've both heard that. If that wasn't kind of a stock phrase, I feel like that joke wouldn't be at all effective versus being not very effective like it was because I told it very badly. We know what a bar is, like we know what a ham sandwich is, we know what a like walks into a bar joke is. The expectation, kind of the default, is that when a bartender says "we don't serve food here," they mean we don't provide food. We're not a restaurant. The counter, the bit that makes the joke funny, is that you're intended to take that phrase literally. You expect to take it with a certain meaning. And the counter is that moment of realization, that aha moment, if you will, that you're intended to understand it in a different sense. What is the expectation and counter and common ground here? Or have I just totally gone bonkers? Is Clover just losing it? So the common ground here is when you look at this puzzle, you know what a killer cage is. You know what an anti-night constraint is. I know, just right from the very beginning, That like if I put, a 1 there, I can't have another 1 there, nowhere that's seen by a knight's move. And I also know that whatever's in these cages has to sum to the values that are given. My expectation from having solved killer cage puzzles before is that generally, unless your cage is a straight line, generally you don't get to eliminate a digit from a whole cage. Usually your moves are not based on saying, all of a sudden I know this cage can't have a 1 in it. And here is the counter that Phistomefel gives us. The counter is, hold on a second, with these specific little cross-shaped cages, if I put a 1 here, I actually do eliminate a 1 from these entire cages in one fell swoop. And that's the aha moment that is central to the success of this puzzle. Also, this is another good example of a puzzle that is fair about its difficulty, in the sense that it's dead obvious that what's going on here is some kind of shenanigans with how cross-shaped killer cages work. I mean, if that wasn't the case, why would Phistomefel have put 5 of them on the grid? But do I know what is happening? Not until I start exploring. I know where to look. Phistomefel is showing me where to go. I don't know what I'm going to find there. And that realization that what I found there is something that, while being based in common ground, still is just a little counter to my natural instinctive expectations as a solver, is what gives me that aha feeling. And I really do think that this and humor are the same thing at heart. People have actually told me more than once while solving my puzzles that my puzzle made them laugh. And not in the sense of like, it's haha funny, there's no joke in my puzzle. But it seems completely natural to me that when you suddenly realize that a cell that you're looking at that you thought was totally unrestricted is actually restricted to just 1 digit, that's kind of funny. That sometimes makes me want to laugh. At the end of the day, again, feel free to just throw away everything that I'm saying here and just make some puzzles. Like, I don't want anybody to see this talk as a barrier to entry. But as a setter, I see myself as having a tough job. I want to let the solver know where to go by doing the type of signaling that I talked about in the first half of this talk. I want to give them some common ground to begin with. I don't want them to look at the puzzle and say, I have no idea, I've never seen anything like this before in my life. And the common ground may be as simple as just, I know they know the rules of Sudoku. So I know that they are looking at a specific spot, and I want to put a surprise, a moment of emotional catharsis there waiting for them. This is a puzzle that I set. It's called Boxes. And even though I think a lot of solvers would disagree with me, I see this as my most successful Sudoku so far. So, why am I saying that this puzzle was successful? Thinking about it, I think that fundamentally, a lot of the success here comes from the very first couple of moves in this puzzle. When you start solving this puzzle, so this is a quadruples and killer cage puzzle. When you start solving this puzzle, you know what a killer cage is, and you know that a digit can only appear once in a killer cage. You also know what a quadruple is. These little circles tell you that 3, 4, and 5 have to appear surrounding the circle. 4, 5, and 6 have to appear in those cells. 5, 6, and 7 have to appear in those cells, etc. So you know those 2 things. That's our common ground. And you also just generally know how to solve killer puzzles. The counter to the expectation is the way in which those rules combine. Because the intended opening of this, and I'll just give an example with this one cage, is to notice that you have to use at least 2 of those 3 digits in the cage, because there's only one space left over that could contain one of those digits 3, 4, and 5 that's not in the cage. So you got to use 2 of them. If we were to use 3 and 4, then what would our 3rd digit have to be? It would have to be another 4. If we were to use 3 and 5, what would our 3rd digit have to be? It would have to be another 3. So we have to be using, in this cage, 4 and 5. The 3rd digit is going to be a 2, and our 3 has to go there. And the same is true for every cage around the central box. Here, if we used 4 and 5, our other digit would have to be a 5. So the common ground is just how the rules work. You know that you can't repeat a digit in a killer cage. You know that quadruples tell you that those digits have to be present. The expectation is that generally when you're working with a killer cage, you're going to be kind of chipping away values one at a time, and you're going to use, most likely, the rule about only having a value once in a cage in specific situations. For instance, you may use it when you already have a digit or 2 in the cage to eliminate other digits, or to eliminate that same digit from other positions in the cage. You might use it when you're initially figuring out the possible combinations for a cage. But using it like this, totally within the grounds of the rule. But it feels like this aha moment because it subverts the expectations established through previous solving. And that, I think, is where you get those moments. And that's what I'm proud of in that puzzle. Here's what's worth remembering from this. Especially if you're a new setter, I know this seems obvious, but keep it in your head. Novelty doesn't equal having something in your Sudoku that nobody's ever seen before. In fact, trying to start by creating something nobody's ever seen before is setting yourself up for failure in a lot of cases. It is just as rewarding to solve something that derives its novelty from the way the solve plays out, in my opinion, as it is to solve something that derives its novelty from the fact that I've never seen those rules before in my life. I have more fun as a setter thinking of ways that I can create fresh feeling, unexpected interactions from rules that are already known. Aha moments, characteristic of a great solve, they have a lot in common with humor. Remember Clover telling the really bad joke? There's a formula to creating one. You need to set up a situation where there's a certain expectation, and then you need to subvert it. That means you need to understand what your solver's expectations are. To get there, solve a lot. Watch other people solve. I find it incredibly helpful to watch people live solve my puzzles or solve other people's puzzles, especially if they're willing to talk about how they solve. Watching Cracking the Cryptic helps with this. Practice setting more traditional variants and push yourself to try to make them feel fresh. This will help you understand what your solvers will expect to see so that you can turn around and subvert it. How do you do that? Well, one of the great secrets of life, in my opinion, is that nobody's born with ideas, and nobody is born with the ability to come up with good ideas. Why do great puzzle setters seem to be an endless font of ideas? It's not because some people are just naturally good at thinking up ideas or just naturally have ideas, and those people are destined to be the people who create the best puzzles. No, thinking of interesting ways, interesting novel ways to subvert an expectation is a learnable skill. And the more you practice it and the more you think about it, the more ideas you will find coming to you. Talk to people a lot about puzzles, solve a lot of puzzles, be patient, and you will end up with more ideas than you could set in a lifetime. Also, I'm pretty sure all puzzle setters steal. I hope I'm not the only one. People are watching this video now like, Clover, you're the only person who steals other people's ideas. No, I like to solve puzzles with the eye of a setter. I like to solve puzzles with the expectation that I'm looking for little moves, little logical moments that I can steal from my own puzzles. And at the end of the day, our hobby, puzzle setting, it's play. It's this grand game. And play teaches you in this hobby. And when I say play, I mean doing things like speed setting, challenge yourself to set a good puzzle in an hour. Collaborative puzzle setting, you set a puzzle with one person, set a puzzle with 10 other people. Personally, I like to do little prove this has no solutions puzzles because that gets me thinking about things that almost are valid in a Sudoku, but just fail just a tiny bit. And a lot of the time, when I set out trying to show something has no solutions, I end up with a dozen ideas for a puzzle using that same concept. And just give yourself permission to daydream about, I wonder how this constraint works, or, what happens if I do that? Because one of the really beautiful things about puzzle setting is that playing will make you better at it. I'm a big believer in the power of play, and that is what drew me to this hobby in the first place. All right, my friends, that's what I've got to share. If there's one last thing I can say, it's that even though I've given a lot of advice and a lot of prescriptions, please don't allow any of what I've said to feel like a barrier to setting or solving puzzles. Because at the end of the day, unless you're getting paid to do this, if you're having fun, you're doing it right. You are invited to the conversation, no matter who you are and how you choose to participate. You are invited to just try stuff and see what happens. So even though I've had a whole lot to say about my opinions on how setting works, be aware that this is only my process. I hope that there are bits and pieces of it that can help anybody, but I also acknowledge that there's nothing in it that is good for everybody. So watch the other setter talks. There are a lot of people who are brilliant and capable and talented and accomplished who have come out to share how it is they do what they do. Take bits and pieces from all of them. And if you have questions, if you have more thoughts, I'm an open book. You can email me at sudokuklover@gmail.com. You can pop on Discord. My name on there is Clover on the Cracking the Cryptic Discord server. Feel free to reach out. I can't guarantee that I'll always be able to help, but I am more than interested in listening to what novice setters are thinking about, or really what anybody's thinking about. It's been a pleasure. Thanks, Simon and Mark, for allowing me to use your platform, and I hope you all have a great day.